in the American Sign Language Department here at UVA, and she has over 20 years of teaching experience at the K through 12 level and 19 years of experience teaching at the university level. She helped found the Virginia American Sign Language Teachers Association, where she served as the president for 8 years. Dr. Jennings-Arey has earned degrees in deaf education, sign language education, literacy specialization, and administration and supervision, and she earned her doctorate degree in post-secondary and adult education. So please welcome Dr. Jennings-Arey. I forgot 2 more introductions. We also have 2 lovely interpreters here, Mona and Letty. Thank you.
So who's going to be controlling PowerPoint? You expect me to walk back and forth, right? You want me to slide on over there and slide on back? All right, are we good? Hello, greetings everybody. I don't know where you got my bio, but thank you so much for that lovely introduction. This is my sign name, it's RJ. So the deaf community, we typically go by our sign name, so mine is RJ. And often, formally people will call me by my first name. I do not care for it. I prefer to go by RJ. And so when people think, well, why are you spelling it? I'm hoping that no one's gonna ask. But anyway. So I was asked to come present tonight. I just did not know exactly what I would bring. You guys are seniors, you're graduating soon. I'm sure you've already heard all the lectures. So I thought, well, why don't I share a little bit about myself and my journey as a deaf individual and what I've learned since becoming deaf. Hopefully it will fascinate you a bit about what my experience was like. All right, next slide. Okay, so unfortunately, oftentimes, folks will make a mistake, and often I have to make a disclaimer. I'm not here to have any kind of negative rhetoric, but really, for me as an individual, what I've seen is that this is my experience. So it's really important that I emphasize that this is going to be my narrative tonight, okay? Next slide. So, of course, what was the beginning of my life? I was born, right? So here I am, Miss Rhonda Jenny, perfect baby, I was hearing. Never even had to think twice about it. My parents, they both achieved their high school diplomas. Both of them are from farmers, from a lineage of farmers, so it's really important to keep that in mind. And the majority of my family are from the Appalachian Mountains, or also known as Appalachia. So with that, we have a really strong background of farmers. We were poor, always having to get by. But anytime a neighbor needed help, we would be sure to welcome them with open arms. So now, I was born, and my parents were your typical 1950 type of household. A house with white picket fence. You guys know what I'm talking about. So my father worked, and my mother worked from home. She would take care of me. She would be a stay-at-home mom. So once I was born, my parents felt that they would upsize from a mobile home to a new home that was just recently built. And my mother still lives in that house till this very day. So they have never moved, they've never sold it. So they lived in this house, my dad worked, my mom stayed at home, here's a new baby. So that kind of gives you an idea, a picture of what my life was like. If you were to look at a picture, it's your typical 1950s picture of a family. So like I said, when I was born hearing. I had red hair, I had a white, pale face, but it was all fine because I could hear. So as life progressed, there came a time when I stepped into kindergarten. I was 5 years old, still hearing. I started kindergarten. And I was sitting down watching Sesame Street. Are you guys all familiar with that TV show, Sesame Street? Yeah, okay, thank God, because I know we're from different generations. So Sesame Street, I remember watching it, and I will never forget that day. I mean, it's really embedded in my mind. And nobody was calling my name. You know, again, keep in mind, I was watching television and I'm thinking, my parents were thinking, why is my daughter not responding? Didn't know what the teacher was talking about, but anyway, excuse me, that was the teacher that said that. So lunchtime rolled around, I felt really sick, and was in a classroom where I rested. And in that classroom, there was a shelf with a coat hanger or coat rack, and I remember falling asleep right under there. My dad came to pick me up, and it just got worse. And it happened so fast, and I could just feel myself declining, and I didn't know what was going on. I thought, okay, maybe it's just some kind of flu or sickness. By the time I got home, my parents put me in their bedroom, and keep in mind, their bed was really, really high off the ground, and they set me on their bed, and I just remember feeling funny and just getting worse and declining. And I wanted to call my mom over, but she was on the phone. So I tried to crawl off the bed, and sure enough, I fell, and I couldn't walk. I struggled getting up. So I yelled for my mother. My mother said, "What are you doing? Get up." And I responded that I just simply couldn't. So she called my father over. He came back from work. You know, after driving all the way back there, he came right back home, brought me back to the hospital. And I remember my dad picking me up, and we walked into the hospital, right into the ER, and I was looking at the admissions desk. And after that, I don't know what happened. And then, sure enough, found out I was in a coma for a week. And I ended up catching spinal meningitis. So it's an illness in the spine. And by the time I woke up, I was unable to walk. I do not know why, but I just could not walk. Now, I could still hear. But about a day or two later, when the doctor approached me, they were running some tests. They started talking to me, and I realized that the environment around me was quiet, but yet the doctor's mouth was moving, and I'm thinking, what is going on? I'm like, Mom, I can't hear you. And sure enough, the doctor responded that, yep, there was something that happened to me. And exactly what it was, they didn't quite detect at the time. Now, spinal meningitis can have an impact on the ability to walk. You can go blind. You can have brain damage. There's multiple impacts of your ability. And my outcome was that I became deaf. And I mean totally deaf. I couldn't hear one single thing. Next slide. So, I get home, and I had to work on how to walk again. And I started by crawling, and I was so mad, and I felt so embarrassed and annoyed. And my 3-year-old brother's running around me in circles, and I'm over here having to crawl because I can't walk. I was struggling, and then after a few months, I finally was able to get back on my feet. But I had to rely on holding onto the walls. I was extremely wobbly, but then time after, I was all right. Now, I loved school at the time. And so when I was told that I couldn't return to school, I said, why can't I? And they responded that it was because I was deaf. And I'm thinking, why in the world can I not go back to school? Now, during this time, this was the early 70s, there was no law in place where a deaf person could go into school, where they can mainstream. The resources were scarce, and there was not many places for a deaf person to get their education. Now, my aunt, she's deaf. And it's really funny. I always say that it was my destiny to be deaf because my aunt was deaf and I look like my aunt. And so when I was watching myself on video, I thought, oh my God, I look just like my aunt. And we both share close birthdays, we're 2 days apart. But she became deaf at the age of 12 and I became deaf at 6, half of her age. And really, I am convinced that it's fate. There's just no way of thinking any other reason. My aunt is a key person in my life. She is my dad's older sister, and she was also diagnosed with spinal meningitis. Now, the deafness was not genetic. There is deafness that is passed on over by genes, but that does not exist within our family lineage. So why spinal meningitis was passed on, I'm not sure. But she really advised my parents on what to do with me, and I think that if without her, my parents wouldn't have known how to handle the situation. That she helped progress my ability to learn, to go to school, and so forth. So my aunt, she really encouraged my parents to have me enroll into a deaf school, which means that I would have to stay at a dorm. Now keep in mind, I was 6 years old at the time. And I remember when my daughter was 6, and I looked and I reflect, I said, there's absolutely no way I could take my daughter to a different school and not see her from time to time. It just broke my heart. But, you know, my parents had no choice. We lived about an hour and a half away from the school, but, you know, here we are. And so they said, you're gonna go to school, and they're really trying to emphasize by having me lip read. And by the time I got to this school, I look around, and here, this deaf school is very old. The buildings are extremely old. And I'm walking through these corridors thinking, this place is creepy. So I get into the school, and everybody's just signing around me, and I'm thinking, what is everybody doing? And I walk into my bedroom, and I think, okay, here's 4 beds. That means there's a bed for mom, a bed for dad, a bed for me, and a bed for my brother. But that was not the case. They dropped me off. They said, I'll, you know, see you later, and they went home. And so this was at the residential school, and I was unaware of that. But this was very common, where the parents could not communicate to their child. And of course, I couldn't lip read. I was born hearing, and I could still talk, but I couldn't hear. And I was a very shy girl, so I really had a hard time making eye contact. But anyway, so I see these mouths moving, and I'm thinking, what are you saying? There was no communication success between the two of us. Anyway, so I'm seeing all these kids around me signing, and I'm thinking, where in the world am I? And I just didn't know what was happening. So really, that was the beginning of my deaf journey. Next slide, please. So, now we come to a place where we have to learn a new language. My parents learned C, which is signing exact English. What that means is that they literally sign word for word in English order, which is not considered a language. It's a mode of communication, but not a language. So my parents learned signing exact English, and of course in the 70s that was a very popular method. And my brother didn't even bother learning. Instead, we just worked through gesturing and home signs. And as for me, I had to learn American Sign Language, so our communication was not aligned, and I had to figure out later in life that I was in survival mode. Now, I want to back up just a little bit. My parents, as soon as they had found out that I was deaf, they immediately were looking for classes to learn sign language, which I am so grateful for. It is not common that that happens, and it's very unfortunate. They learned sign language, even though it ended up being signing exact English, C. And now, since I've picked up American Sign Language and I've taught that to them, we're able to communicate to one another. But anytime that they use C, I have no idea what it is they're doing. Next slide, please. So now, I became deaf, and I'm no longer like my family. I end up drifting as my own identity as a different person. I did not have the same experiences as my brother. So as a deaf individual, I had a different path. I went to the Virginia School for the Deaf and Blind, which is located in Stanton, Virginia. I was there for 1 year, and I can say that I hated it. I absolutely hated it. I cried. I didn't like being there. My parents didn't know what to do with me. And then it wasn't until they found other parents that had experience by putting their students into this abandoned school where there was classrooms available. There was just 2 classrooms, and it was a self-contained class, and that is where you would find deaf children of different ages. And the reason this happened was because there was no law in place to mainstream deaf students. So I attended this abandoned school, if you will, until Public Law 94-142 was passed. Once that was passed, that meant that public schools had to accept students with a disability, regardless what disability you had. So I finally was mainstreaming. Now, I was fortunate that I never had an interpreter, and I'll tell you why I say that. In college, anytime that there's a public speaker or a workshop, the interpreter, and there's an interpreter provided, I call that a three-way learning. So I'm having to work through what the presenter's saying, and then what the interpreter's saying, and then how I'm processing it. And often it doesn't, it's a routine. I'm having to work hard. Whereas I'm able to do one-on-one communication, I'm able to attain more information. But fortunately, the teacher was a teacher of the deaf, and she was able to sign, so there was no need to have an interpreter. And during that time when they passed that law, you know, there was not a lot of interpreters available, and often you'd have to rely on your friend or a family member to interpret. And so, since I attended the self-contained class, I was able to work with students that had the same identity as me. And then I'd go home, I'd eat a snack, watch a favorite show, and I would feel, okay, I'm no different than my brother. You know, that's my way of perceiving it. But my deaf aunt, she came in and she said, it is time for you to get you back at the deaf school. And I refused, I resisted. I did not like going to the deaf school. And the reason why was because at the residential dorms, there was this one caretaker who was there who I didn't like. But my aunt let me know that she was no longer there. And so when I returned, so many people remembered me from that 1 year that I attended. So I thought, okay, in my classroom, there was only 4 of us that knew me. But at the Virginia School for the Deaf and Blind, there were so many people who knew me. My mother gave me the choice to choose my education. And once I made that decision, then I wouldn't move around. So I was about 10 years old. Can you imagine having to make a life decision at the age of 10? You know, I look at my kids, I look at my grandchildren, you know, I just think they don't even know what they're doing today, so how could they make a decision? So to throw that on me was a lot. So all right, I returned back to the residential school. I'm at the school for the deaf. After my family begging me, I then decided to go, and I ended up loving it, and I'm glad I did. So now, being back at the SDB, I had to learn how to be deaf. Even though I've been deaf this whole time, even though I went to the self-contained classrooms and I tried communicating with my brother, I thought, you know, there was no difference. But now, going to the school and then having to stay there for the week and returning home on Friday, I would feel a disconnect. I didn't know who my brother was, didn't understand who my parents were. So I started to drift away. It was different. Next slide.
So now the teen years. So, you know, if you think hearing teenagers and deaf teenagers is way different, it's definitely not. We both get pickles, we both have crushes. We worry about the clothes that we wear, we worry about, you know, our friends. It's the exact same, whether you're hearing or deaf. If people perceive, you know, deaf teenagers are different, it's definitely not the truth. It's the same kind of path as a teenager, period. So, as a teenager, I gotta do everything right. Teenagers think they know everything. But, of course, I was one of those. And I'm sure many of you experienced that. Maybe not until you're 20s or so, looking back on when you were a teenager, thinking you knew everything and being like, oh, I actually did not. So, I went to the deaf school, and that meant that I had deaf adults around me as my role models. My aunt as well, she was a deaf adult who I could look up to, but the teachers themselves were deaf. I would watch them and look up to them. My dorm supervisors were deaf. And the communication access there was easy. There was no barriers, and I could grow without worrying about struggling to communicate. And that's probably the most important part of growing up as a teenager there. And that's what got me to where I am now. If I had stayed in that self-contained classroom, you know, maybe I would end up the same, I'm not sure, maybe I'd end up just fine. But, you know, I hated that kind of three-way learning like I mentioned before. That direct learning is very important. You know, I didn't really have a choice going to VSDB, but it ended up being the best option for me in the long run. Even the principal at that time was deaf, which was really nice. At that age, you learn what you care about and what's important to you. You figure out where you want to go, you're debating whether or not you want to go to college. Again, myself as a teenager, no different. However, at the same time, with my role models, they kept making sure, they said, no, you have to fight, you have to stand up for yourself. They really emphasized this stuff, and I hadn't really understood why. Because I found out that I was kind of sheltered at my home and learning more at the residential school about life in general. I thought it was no big deal at the time. And so comparing myself to my brother, you know, as he was a teenager, you know, I think, oh yeah, we were definitely the same. But we definitely had the differences to be able to, the main difference there was access, was communication access. I had hearing friends in elementary school that were so dear to me, so close, and of course, you know, they all drifted away. They were too cool for me. And so that made me want to stay at the deaf school even more. You know, I stayed on the weekends. Now they don't allow that, but you know, back then I stayed on the weekends. My struggles as a teen, you know, like I'm saying, it's no different, but struggles as a deaf teen are a bit more specific. So, high school senior, getting ready to graduate, people mentioning college, I was like, no, thank you. But of course, if I didn't go to college, I would be here, right? Lecturing. And so, of course, I was definitely not interested at all. My close friends were like, psh, I don't go to college. Just go straight to the workforce. And I was like, okay, you know. My family definitely didn't care about college. They're like, it's your decision. And so again, I had that huge responsibility on my shoulders, just as when I was, as a 10-year-old, deciding whether or not to go to the mainstream school or the deaf school. And so, Gallaudet University is the only university in the world specifically designed for deaf and hard of hearing individuals. They have their own programs. So regular universities, you know, like universities have their own ASL department for deaf specific things, but Gallaudet is deaf everything. There are general studies there. So, I mean, of course, you know, I wasn't great at school. I didn't study, I didn't do my homework. I was not a great high school student. And so, of course, I shoved aside the idea of going to college. But when it came time to it, you know, and I love my parents, but the idea of staying home, you know, because I'm looking back every year during the summer, and I would imagine, you know, graduation would be just like those summers at home. My parents told me, no, you can't drive. They were so nervous about me driving. I thought I had a driver's license. Okay, I could drive. They still told me, no, I can't go driving now. I can't go out. And so, you know, I didn't want to stay at my parents' house after graduation. So what was I going to do? So of course, you know, I stayed in my room and read books. That's all I really did during summer. If you can imagine, you know, the rest of my life, stuck in my room reading books, no thank you. So I was like, okay, you know what, I'm going. So I just went ahead and did it, you know, just to get out of staying home. I guess that's a good reason to go to college, I'm not really sure, but I did it anyway. So now, going into college, there's another growing up, which I'm sure you guys are experiencing, of course. You know, graduating high school, you feel different, you're growing more, and even after this, you're not finished growing. I definitely was not finished growing at the time. So during this time, I definitely drifted even further from my family. I was in Washington, D.C., you know, summers I stayed at school, I stayed in D.C., and every once in a while I would go home for Christmas, you know, catching up with my friend or something. So we definitely grew further and further apart from there. So, if you see the growing apart from my decalogue, I put on my slide here, and I feel like I did kind of, because my really close friends from high school did not go to college. So once I went to Gallaudet, I would come back home, and they looked at me and they're like, "You're different." And I was like, "No, what are you talking about? I'm the same." They're like, "No, you're different." And they totally, you know, ostracized me. And I was so confused, just because I was different. I didn't see the difference that they saw. I felt the same. But they saw the way that I was signing, the things I talked about, and that was the change that they had noticed. So my senior year was the same year of Deaf President Now. If you don't know anything about it, go ahead and Google it. So during that protest, I was a senior, and I really wanted to fight for the rights that they were fighting for as well, to get a deaf president of the university, because historically it had been hearing presidents. And, you know, at the time they were like, "No, you need a hearing president to help you out, you know, you guys don't know what you're doing." You know, that kind of narrative, you know, came out of, you know, it's still around today, of course. And so this was a protest to fight against that kind of narrative and what it means to advocate for yourself. And that's one thing that I really, really value in my life, even today, is advocating for myself. If I didn't advocate for myself, I'd be 6 feet under. So I went to college, I had new labels, new identities, new issues. And then after DPN, Deaf President Now, I felt like my world had completely shifted. When I think of DPN and the impact it had on me, you know, I think, okay, I'm an adult, I'm gonna graduate soon, I gotta do something. I can't just sit around and do nothing. If I just let the world oppress me, I won't get anywhere. So I was faced with that. And going forward, I figured that I had to advocate for myself, and kind of, it was kind of like, okay, like, that's a lot of work, but I had to. There was no choice. And it was really defining in a way. And I felt defeated by having to do that hard work, fighting against the system. So after Gallaudet, they had access, they had everything available to me, but, you know, for the in-between, you know, I would ride through, so in the event I would get on a bus, a taxi, I would notice, you know, instances of discrimination that I never experienced before. And so that was during my time at Gallaudet. But, you know, after that, I was like, you know, where am I supposed to go? My degree that I graduated was food and nutrition. I wanted to be a nutritional scientist at the time. You know, I wanted to work for the USDA. They said, "Nah, you're deaf, you can't do it." Literally, they said that in the letter. They said, "No, you can't work here because you're deaf." I kept it. I wish I kept that letter, honestly. So I was really defeated. I had no idea where I was supposed to work with this degree. And I was in a state of shock from there. So I did some odd jobs. I was a dorm supervisor overnight. I worked at a pizza place. I worked, I was a bus aide for the Kendall School. It was an elementary school within the Gallaudet campus. So there was a lot of barriers, even though Deaf President Now was a huge, you know, protest to fight for rights. you know, it still doesn't mean that those barriers are gonna go away automatically. So, you know, I tried to work for the USDA, they said no to me, all these other institutions said no to me. So I said, okay, I guess I'll go back to this deaf school and work. Easy. Does that mean I had any personal growth going back to where I went to high school? So at the deaf school, my fiance had a job there. And so we were in DC, and so we went back to DC. I was working as bus aide. It's a DC law, you know, if there's a disabled kid on the bus, there needs to be a aide there. Doesn't matter what kind of disability, there has to be an aide. So I was a bus aide in DC. Everyone looking up at me. You know, I was helping everybody with their homework, even though those kids, you know, didn't really know sign. You know, I felt very fortunate to have a signing environment at home, even though these kids, they didn't have one at all. And so I was inspired to go into deaf ed from there, and that's where I am today. You know, I felt like I was paying back for what the community did for me in becoming a deaf role model for those deaf students on the bus when I was a bus aide. So I went to Wyoming. They didn't have a deaf school. They had a rehabilitation school for children 8 and above who didn't have a home, were incarcerated previously, were pregnant and were kicked out of their home, kids like that who needed stability. And I just graduated. I'm a green little, you know, degree holder, what am I supposed to do? And so my friend wanted me to go over there and, you know, work for them. And I was like, oh geez, it's so different, way out west, you know, whatever. So, at the time, my husband, you know, I asked him what I should do. You know, he said, oh, why don't you go and I'll stay. So we were long distance, and I went with my daughter. She was 15 months old at the time. And so we went to Wyoming, you know, tried to set up a life for ourselves. I was so homesick all the time, but I learned so much there about trying to set up a program for the deaf, but there was still so much discrimination, so much in the laws that I had to fight for. And normally, you know, I just, you know, keep quiet, accept the fact, and keep on moving on, but just for some reason I couldn't let it go. And I really stood up and I said, no, you can't do this, you know. And I really wanted these deaf children to have access to education. So even though I was there for a short time, I still felt super brave. It was a new place. And so, you know, time went on, and they finally listened. They got a new teacher to teach the deaf kids there, and then I moved back to DC. So at the treatment program, there were some deaf students there, you know, and I was like, why are you guys here? You know, and they were just so angry because of the lack of communication access. There was one boy who hit people, including their teachers, because he was so frustrated, but he never, ever, ever hit me. With me there, even though I was only there for about 4 months, he was so successful in the treatment program, he graduated, he went back to his hometown, and everything was good. All it took was communication access. You know, some of these situations were super serious and, you know, needed a lot more dedication and work, but the only thing missing was that communication. It's a very sparse area out there as well, and so, you know, resources are few and far between. So, deaf schools, you know, are a bilingual school, ASL and English. There's no barriers. The principal's deaf. You know, when I was in the SDB. But at the same time, I saw some of the inner city kids there, and I'm going to talk about a little bit about the 9% formula, you know, a little bit more at the end. But At the same time, I had realized at the time that deaf schools were kind of like a deaf utopia. I don't know if you guys have read Niall DeMarco's book called Deaf Utopia. You know, that's kind of what I felt like it was. Mayor's from Maryland. Not sure if he feels like it's a deaf utopia, you know, but there's a strong deaf upper echelon there. They know what they're doing. They set the rules and procedures to make sure that things are well for the students. And so I had a big life change. I got divorced. I moved back to Virginia, and it's definitely not a deaf utopia there. I felt like there were a lot of hearing administration. They weren't taking care of the students. They only were looking out for their own interests and not their students' interests. And so it was completely different. And I noticed those changes. And I definitely was back to fighting and advocating again because I really, really cared for that job.
So while I was in Virginia, here as I am right now, I was a single mother. My daughter, who is a CODA means a child with deaf abilities. And that's that 90% formula that I'll touch on a little bit later. So again, I was divorced, and my life with my family was so different. My parents never divorced. They had a strong foundation. They stayed together, whereas for me, it was a bit different. And my mom would often look at me and say, "Look at you." I'm like, "What? It's not my fault." So, as I got older, I started drifting more and more apart from my family. I mean, there was a huge divide. I'd visit every once in a while, once or twice a year. Even though I could communicate with them, they started to forget because they weren't able to utilize the language that I use. And because I chose my deaf family, so to speak, I would stay with them during the holidays, and then I would return home. And my parents were so disappointed. They were heartbroken. They just were not able to understand that. But you know, when they're all communicating, everyone's just yapping away, not signing, and I'm just sitting there bored, whereas I have full access when I'm around my friends. We're signing. Okay, so now, my daughter, again, who's a CODA, right? So she is immersed in the deaf world. But she also has her foot in the hearing world. So her experience is entirely different. There were a lot of things that she had a hard time digesting. I'm often having to look for support. My cousin, who was a CODA herself, was angry. You know, my cousin, she was dependent on by her parents to have to interpret. Now, there's one change that has taken place in the deaf community, and that's technology. They went from captioning to TTY, which is text relay. But at the time, you know, that didn't exist. So my aunt had to rely on her daughter to make phone calls to a doctor's appointment at such a young age. But that's the reality. She had to interpret everything for her mom because there's no interpreters to be found. It was not a profession at the time. So my aunt, she doesn't even understand the terminology what an interpreter does. Whereas for myself, I was able to witness history change. The good happened for the deaf community, right? But when it's always one step forward, sure enough, it's several steps back. And what I mean by that is Facebook. Facebook video option. Now, I remember at the time there was no option to go live. There were no captions. And then eventually they started to work on it. They would provide captions for videos that would be uploaded, but then the live option came out, and then sure enough, we took those steps back. But after some time, they created the feature where it's auto-generated. So again, it's always taking one step forward, two steps back with everything that's developed and a benefit for the deaf community. It's very frustrating, but anyway, back to my daughter. Yeah, so, you know, just looking at her and looking at my cousin, I thought, I don't want her to be angry, and I don't want her to just hold this animosity towards us. So, even though, you know, I would encourage her to interpret. Now, real quick, I want to touch on this. I want you to all imagine this, picture this. I walk into a doctor's office, there's no interpreters, right? Whereas today it's different. And my daughter was at the, maybe, I would say she's 3 or 4 years old. Would you think to ask my daughter what's wrong with me? Do you think a 3 or 4-year-old has the capability to understand what to do with that? It's not even her job. She doesn't know what to do. She does have language, but yet that doctor, in that instance, decided to just rely on to, hey, can you tell your mom this? Why would you do that? I mean, would you do that with hearing parents, with your hearing children? You wouldn't even think twice. But it wasn't right. But unfortunately, in the deaf community, for a deaf person, things had to change. I mean, there were so many things that I would witness and I would question, like, where is your common sense? And I see it all the time. But my daughter didn't understand. Or sometimes my daughter would be sweet enough to offer. She's like, Mom, let me go ahead and interpret. I'm like, no, don't interpret. Okay, fine. But I just did not want her to have any animosity just based off of what I saw with my cousin, because she was angry all the time having to interpret for her mother. Next slide, please. Okay, so I did touch on this earlier. Now, the longer I got to experience what it was like to be a deaf an adult, the more experiences I had, the more eye-opening situations I encountered. There were barriers everywhere. But, again, with technology, opportunity took off. There was a movie role with a deaf actor, so it's deaf representation. But I don't want to be in a place where I'm stuck. You know, if I don't do anything, then I would be stuck. So I had to return to school and go through the list of different majors, figuring out what I wanted to do with my life. But I knew I had to go back and make these changes for myself. So the question is, am I done with school? I don't think so. I don't know, but again, seeing deaf representation is so minute in this world. It's not often you see it. And we're not at a place where we see where it's normalized, where there is no fear when crossing paths with a deaf individual. So I want to talk about this syndrome here, Medusa syndrome, which basically means me as a deaf person, I am Medusa. So what happens when you lock eyes with Medusa's snake, right? You turn into stone. You see these snakes on my hair? And you just freeze. But often that's how deaf people feel. You know, so here, let me give you an example. Going into 7-Eleven, right? I walk in and I'm thinking, okay, what do I want to order? And the cashier just starts talking and then they just freeze up when I let them know I'm deaf. And I'm like, hey, do you want to try riding with me back and forth? And they're just like stone, frozen. And I'm like, grab a pen, grab a piece of paper. I mean, I'm being serious. They're terrified out of their wits. And I want to see those changes. I want to be able to walk into a store, simple as that. But still, in 2023, these experiences still take place. Now, I do see some things changing, like folks taking interest in learning sign language. So I'll have a person say, hey, I know some sign language. I'm like, okay, you're not afraid of me. Don't worry, we don't bite. But you know, it's often talked about within the deaf community. I'm like, hey, do you think we're contagious? Do you think people think that if we touch them, they're going to become deaf? You won't. It's not any kind of disease that's contagious. Now, if I had the flu, you're definitely going to catch the flu, which is different. But you won't become deaf just by approaching us. Next slide, please. Okay, so it brings me to today, right? With Medusa, the Medusa syndrome still, I have to deal with that sometimes. And I am tired of it. I really want to emphasize that I'm exhausted by these experiences. You know, having to say, hey, I can't hear, I just would sign I'm deaf. Or I'll just use my phone and I'll let them know through text that I'm deaf. And even by looking at my phone, they're just terrified. But I'm trying to be proactive. I'm trying not to instill that fear in a hearing person who approaches me. But you know, something that seems so simple as that, to serious situations where interacting with law enforcement, where they're unable to communicate with deaf people, the fire department, the medical industry, they don't have the basic foundation on how to interact with us. And really, it's a waste of time. So it's those experiences that need to take place. And we're seeing change, but we still got a long way to go. So I'm disappointed, it's 2023, and everyone's like, it's 2023. And I'm like, yeah, you would think that it's better, but it's not. It's still there. The discrimination still exists. We are not at a place where it's the future. And what that looks like is that people are not afraid of us. They're not afraid to interact with us and hand over a piece of paper and a pen and know what to do from there. We need to get to that place. And there are some days that are better than others. I have witnessed some changes, but most of the time I don't. It's like we're still stuck in the past. I want to share a story. My husband, he's a smoker. There was one Christmas morning, we were at 7-Eleven, once again. This is a 24-hour 7-Eleven. And my husband goes in, and he wants to buy some cigarettes. I walked over to get some drinks. I just completely ignored him. And then I look over and I see the cashier, and the cashier just has this attitude, and he wasn't afraid, but he just didn't care. And my husband would point like, hey, can I get that cigarette? You know how they have a display where all the cigarettes are, so he'd point over to the cigarette that we want. And the cashier just looks at him like he's stupid. And he's saying, my husband's saying, hey, I want to get that cigarette right there. And the cashier said, nope, let me serve the next person. And he was mad. And he said, hey, I want that cigarette. And by that time, he's like starting to lean over at the counter, right? And he's the cashier is now threatening him, saying, I'm going to call the cops if you get over on this counter. And my husband was just very adamant about pointing at the cigarettes that he wanted. And he would say, just move over, I'm going to serve the next person. And my husband did not understand why. All he wanted was to purchase the cigarettes. But the cashier did not want to put any energy by turning around and grabbing the cigarettes that he was pointing at. That's typically what one would do, but this one in particular refused. So my daughter and his daughter were able to see everything happen right through the windows, and they're seeing our struggle. So they both get out the car, they're both Kodas, keep this in mind, and they just go off on the cashier. And I'm thinking, my daughter, what are you saying? She was 16, 17 at the time, and she's just cussing this cashier out. And the cashier is over here thinking, you shouldn't be out in public, you're nothing but an animal. And they're thinking this because we're deaf. Then why would one think that? So it's those little things that we experience and that we want to see change. I mean, how else are we supposed to communicate? Fine, you don't want to turn your body over to look at the cigarette that we're trying to select, then have them print it out on a piece of paper, have it laid out on the counter so we can point at it. Or drive-thrus, right? Oh, drive-thrus, there's so much discrimination that takes place there. I'll pull through a drive-thru because I cannot talk through the speaker system. And I have my order written on a piece of paper, and they'd say, no, we're not going to take your order. You got to go in and do this. Order in person, inside. And it's gotten better, but this still happens. People are refusing to serve us. And by this time, there are cars lined up in the drive-thru. And it gets to the point where they would shut the window in our face. And why? Why would we be treated that way? You know, I would see orders go in from previous, and mine would just stay behind. I mean, I'm wondering that, you know, they should develop the kiosk where you're able to self-serve, just like you would find in Sheetz. McDonald's, they're starting to go with that approach as well. So those are the kind of changes that need to take place. But, you know, looking back, reflecting on my life, it does make me feel sick, and it hurts. You know what that cashier did to my husband? My children shouldn't have to get out of the car to defend us. But you know, the funny part about that story is that, so I'm walking up, right, I'm getting this drink, and I'm seeing this altercation happen right before my eyes. They leave, I'm standing there with my soda, and I'm thinking, okay, I have no money on me. I'm looking at my drink, I'm like, how am I supposed to pay for this? You know, and this is a fountain drink, right? And I'm trying to purchase this fountain drink. And there was a guy in line who said, hey, it's okay, I got you, I'm gonna pay for it. And I was so nervous, like, thank you, I just had to get out of there. But that is the funny part of the story. But really, I mean, we shouldn't even have to go through that in the first place. You know, what's the point of getting the emotions out of us? I mean, he's human. Next slide, please.
Okay, sorry, one short time. So, looking back, reflecting on what I've learned, I mean, I still have a long way to go. You all can be our allies if you have the right attitude. People will listen to you, hearing people, not us, deaf people, unfortunately. We need our shield. Be our shield. You know, I'll be behind you, telling you what to say. I can lead, I can guide you. But at the end of the day, they're going to listen to the majority. Change happens through education, awareness, and spreading the word. There's nothing wrong with getting a piece of paper and communicating with somebody. You know, even sometimes that doesn't work, but it's better than nothing. I also learned that my deafness being perceived as, you know, as broken, you know, that doesn't mean that me, RJ, I'm broken, really. It's just like my deafness is just a part of just like my freckles are. It's just a feature of my ears. You know. I want to be seen as RJ, not as, oh, that deaf lady. Oh, she's deaf. Like, no. I just want to be known as RJ. I don't want to go into an office and like, oh, that's that deaf lady. You know, it's like, I had a name. Why aren't you calling me by my name? You know, if you try to communicate with me and they're messing up, you know, someone's like, oh, she's deaf, it's okay. And they just ignore me. It doesn't make sense. And so over the years, I'm really thankful for my residential schools in Gallaudet and being within the deaf world to grow my identity and my language and education and grow stronger and not become very passive. But I still feel stuck in some ways. It's hard to make changes as one person. So I wanted to share a recent experience. I was so shocked, like my jaw was on the floor. But it's still, unsurprising. Lead K, it's a bill for happening right now for debt collection for deaf children's rights. And the Board of Visitors that runs the Virginia School for the Deaf and Blind had a meeting because we want the superintendent to leave, the superintendent of Virginia School for the Deaf and Blind to leave because she's not really doing her job in a way that the people like. And so we went to the meeting of Board of Visitors, and she's here, the superintendent. I left my job way back then because